Moving on to the second one on page 10. Questions and answers about the various schools. We go back to the background. Page 21. This letter, thought to have been addressed to Samibo Nichigyo, a priest disciple of Nichiren Daishonin, summarizes the approaches to be taken in refuting the doctrines of the major Japanese Buddhist schools, the Tendai, Zen, True Word, and Nimbutsu, or Pure Land schools in particular. It was written in Kamakura in 1255, some 2 years after the Daishonin first publicly set forth his teaching. Samibo had received his Buddhist education in Rakuji on Mount Hei, the head temple of the Tendai school and a prestigious center of Buddhist learning, where the Daishonin himself had once studied. This was one of several letters the Daishonin wrote to him over the years concerning how to debate with priests representing the various Buddhist schools. This letter is unusual in that it is one of the few works written in his early period that addresses the errors and doctrines of the Tendai school. The Daishonin focuses on the school's misinterpretation of Tendai's doctrines that Dingyo had brought to Japan and used to found the Tendai school. Because again, don't forget Mount Hei got confused and eventually went to True Word. Tendai established the doctrinal classification of the 8 teachings and 5 periods. In this letter, first from the viewpoint of a comparative myo, or wonderful, the relative superiority of the sutras is discussed with the criteria of the 4 teachings of doctrine from among the 8 teachings. In this case, a lenient interpretation is applied in order to allow the first 3 teachings, the Tripitaka connecting and specific teachings, to indicate the possible attainment of Buddhahood. Next, when the relative superiority of the sutras is addressed with the criteria of the 5 periods, a strict interpretation is applied in order to deny the first 4 periods of teaching, the flower, garland, agama, correct and equal, and wisdom sutras, the possible attainment of Buddhahood. Okay. From the standpoint of the absolute myo, all of these sutras are opened up and merged in the Lotus Sutra. However, this viewpoint does not deny that a distinction between the Lotus Sutra, which opens up and merges, and the other sutras, which are opened up and merged, exists. In this letter, the Daishonin points out the misinterpretation of the above doctrine that was widespread in his time, namely that since these provisional teachings of the pre-Lotus Sutras enter into the Great Sea of the Lotus Sutra, there is no longer anything undesirable about them, and thus there is not the slightest need to distinguish them by using the names that they originally bore. The Tendai school itself was guilty of such misinterpretation. On the other hand, in this letter, and his later criticism of the Tendai school, the Daishonin focuses on its incorporation of the esoteric True Word teachings into its doctrines. Next, the Daishonin addresses some core contentions of the Zen school. It represents a separate transmission outside the sutras, independent of words or writings. Its teaching was not transmitted by the Buddha and patriarchs. The teachings of the Buddhist sutra are comparable to a finger pointing at the moon, and this very body is the Buddha. He addresses each of these contentions, paying particular attention to the Zen school's claim that it represents a teaching that is independent of words or writings. Words and writings, he points out, constitute a medium by which human beings can convey the nature of their minds. To deny them is to deny the fact that the Zen school doctrines must be communicated through the 6 sense organs, that is, through the ordinary faculties of human beings that include speech and writing. Next, he briefly explained the method to be used in refuting the 6 schools of Nara, the southern capital, representing the long-established schools of Buddhism in Japan. These are the Flower Garland Dharma Characteristics, 3 treatises, Dharma Analysis Treasury, Establishment of Truth, and the Precept School. These schools were long ago refuted by the great teacher Dengyo, he stated. And for proof of this, he presents the doctrine that the leader of these schools submitted to the imperial court, acknowledging the supremacy of Dengyo's teachings based on the Lotus Sutra. Therefore, no further argument, he says, is necessary. If all the other schools already said he whooped my ass in debate and he knows more than me, end of subject. The Daishonin then moves on to the true word teachings, countering that school's assertion that the Mahavajracana Sutra and other sutras upon which it relies are the same in principle as the Lotus Sutra, and pointing out that the Mahavajracana Buddha, who is central to those scriptures and the school, is not a Buddha associated with this world, there being no record or evidence of his actual existence. Finally, he points out the errors of the Nembutsu or Pure Land school, whose doctrine he refers to as the single most provisional of all the provisional teachings, a dream seen within a dream. He states that since this Amida Buddha upon whom the Pure Land proponents rely is a name without a reality, something existing in name only without a body, then though one may expound it in great detail, the doctrines that could promise rebirth in the Pure Land, preaching them they sound so lofty as Mount Sumeru or as deep as the great ocean. Such doctrines are all utterly useless. Okay, so let me just get through this. This is about 12 more pages. It should take about another hour. But again, he's going to touch on Zen, but he's going to touch on the other schools. Don't feel like I'm just jumping on Zen. It's not the only problem. And here we go from page 10. Also in question and answer format. That's what makes these so beautiful, because these are all refutation writings. Question and answers on the various schools. Question: in expounding its doctrine, does the Lotus School make use of the commentaries of Tentai, Myolo, Dengyo, and others? Answer: indeed it does. These various commentaries serve as a bright mirror to aid in the understanding of its doctrines. Question: how can they serve as a bright mirror? These various commentaries quote from the sutras preached prior to the Lotus Sutra and from the provisional teachings, and do not set these aside. Thus, they say, for example, that the Buddha wisdom shown at the beginning and that at the latter time are alike in representing the principle of perfect and immediate enlightenment. Concerning the Myo are wonderful. The Myo of this teaching and the Myo of the other teachings are not different in meaning. They say that the flower garland, the Lotus Sutra. By the way, in the background, it talked about relative and absolute Myo. And let me clarify real quick what they're talking about so that you'll understand as we go here, right? The comparative Myo and absolute Myo is how they're talking about it. Okay, so comparative Myo is the Myo of comparing the Myo of the Lotus Sutra, the mystic of the Lotus Sutra, versus the mystic that's been referred to in the previous schools, which have to do with otherworldly beings and so forth and so on. Absolute Myo is the Myo that is the perfect law. That's why it was discussed the way it was discussed, of whether you can perceive it now eternally or as it exists in this moment in your mind. The point is that absolute Myo includes everything. Therefore, it includes the Zen Sutra, the Zen teaching, it includes Christianity, it includes everything. Okay? So you got to understand, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo does not exclude anything, not even incorrect things, not even evil. Okay? Fundamental darkness is part of the original state. That's why it can't be escaped as a challenge in being born into the nine worlds. So as he's discussing this at first, they're saying, just understand the difference between comparative Myo when you're comparing the Lotus Sutra to other teachings, or absolute Myo, which is the basis of the Lotus Sutra, is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo in reality, which is part of all things. That's really it. Until Nichiren came along to clarify absolute Myo, it was a point of contention. He's writing from the perspective of absolute Myo is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. Let me clarify that. Let me start over. Question: in expounding its doctrines, does the Lotus Sutra make use of the commentaries of Tentai, Myolo, Dengyo, and the others? Answer: yes, indeed it does. These various commentaries serve as a bright mirror to aid the understanding of its doctrines. How can they serve as a bright mirror? These various commentaries quote from the sutras preached prior to the Lotus Sutra and from provisional teachings that do not set these aside. Thus, they say, for example, that the Buddha wisdom shown at the beginning and that at a later time are alike in representing the principle of perfect and immediate enlightenment. Concerning the myo or wonderful, the myo of this teaching and the myo of other teachings are not different in meaning. They say that the Flower Garland Sutra and the Lotus Sutra both represent the Buddha wisdom, that the Buddha wisdom does not differ in these two, and that the Buddha wisdom set forth in the connecting and specific teaching can be viewed as identical with that of the Lotus Sutra. How can you hold the Lotus Sutra to be uniquely superior to these other teachings? We cannot agree with such ideas because, again, in the common belief in the day of the Daishonin was that since all the teachings were teachings of the Buddha, any one of them could get you there. That's why he's had to go into this comparative myo, explaining that its basis is absolute myo. Answer on page 10, answering this first question. How can you have these other things included then if you're saying the Lotus Sutra is the supreme teaching? How can you refer to teachings that preceded it as part of your expression of it? Okay, so answer. These passages you have cited from the commentary of Tentai most certainly fit with the teaching of the Tendai Lotus School, but you must understand that the 60 volumes of Tentai's commentaries are made up of two types of approaches, that of the way of doctrine and that of the way of enlightenment. The term way of doctrine refers to the doctrinal classification of the sutras, while the term way of enlightenment refers to the inner realization of enlightenment. When at last one comes to the realization from the orally transmitted teachings. That's what that's talking about. When you realize, even though you've been told over and over and over since you started chanting that you're the Buddha, that that's really what it is. You really are the Buddha. That's what he's talking about here. The term way of doctrine refers to the doctrinal classification of the sutras, while the term way of enlightenment refers to the inner realization of enlightenment. With regard to the passages from the commentary that you have just cited, we must first ask to which category of writings and ideas they belong. If they belong to the comments that pertain to the doctrinal teachings, then we must note here that when discussing the doctrinal classification of such teaching, Tentai makes a posits. Okay. Tentai poses three standards of comparison by which one may determine the relative superiority of the Lotus Sutra and the sutras preached before it. What then are these three standards of comparison? First of the three is that which inquires whether or not people of all capacities can attain Buddhahood through a particular sutra. Second is that which inquires whether or not the process of teaching, that is, the process of planting the seed of Buddhahood in people's lives and finally harvesting its fruit by leading them to Buddhahood, is revealed in full. Third is that which inquires whether the original relationship between the teacher and the disciple is revealed. Then we must determine to which of the three categories the passages cited from the commentary belong. If they belong to the first, that concerning whether or not people of all capacities can attain Buddhahood through a particular sutra, then we must further inquire which of the two sets of criteria the answer to this depends on. The criteria pertaining to the four teachings of doctrine and the four teachings of method, or those pertaining to the 5 periods of the Buddha's teachings. If the answer is that it depends on the criteria pertaining to the 4 teachings of doctrine and the 4 teachings of method, then we must note here that with regard to these criteria and to the criteria pertaining to the 5 periods of the Buddha's teaching, the commentaries distinguish between 2 types of interpretation, a lenient interpretation and a strict interpretation. We must therefore ask whether the passages cited are following a lenient interpretation or a strict interpretation. So you can see right from the beginning here, Mr. Lee and anybody else watching this, you really have to be a Buddhist scholar to perceive and understand the breadth of the teachings of Shakyamuni correctly, because there's all kinds of caveats that Shakyamuni inserted as time went on. He says, and the Daishonin has done all of that because it's the latter day of the law. It's time to chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, not study Shakyamuni's teachings. Okay? So, he continues on page 11. If one cannot distinguish between passages that depend on the criteria pertaining to the 4 teachings of doctrine and the 4 teachings of method, and those that depend on the criteria pertaining to the 5 periods, or between a lenient interpretation and a strict interpretation, then we would have to say that though one claims to be a follower of the Tendai school, one is grossly ignorant of the doctrines of that school. So he says, if you can't make those determinations, then you haven't studied about Tentai's teaching, which is what the Tendai Dengyo started, the Tendai school, Mount Hei, which ultimately slandered and went to True Word. You can't really say that you're a follower of that teaching unless you then also acknowledge that you are grossly ignorant of the doctrines that that school is actually based upon. The teachings of the Tendai Lotus School use these doctrinal classifications to reveal the original intentions of the various Buddhas. If one is ignorant of these doctrinal classifications and yet tries to discuss the teachings of the Lotus Sutra, then the great teacher Dengyo has said, though one praises the Lotus Sutra, one on the contrary kills its very heart. That is, one destroys the intent of the sutra. And what that is actually saying is that if you try and qualify what the Lotus Sutra is saying without any faith, or in order to discredit the Lotus Sutra or to elevate one of the inferior teachings to be equal, you're going to completely screw up, make a lot of bad karma for yourself, because though one praises the Lotus Sutra by bringing it into the fray to discuss and to qualify as having something of validity to offer, though one praises the Lotus Sutra, one on the contrary kills its very heart, because at the point in time you're comparing it to other things, you're diminishing its superior. In these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth. The only thing that reveals the true purpose of Shakyamuni's lifetime of teachings is the Lotus and Nirvana Sutra. So whenever these other schools, like the Flower Garland, like all the 3 Amida Sutras, like the sutras that Zen relies upon, like the Dharma Treasury and all the Dharma characteristics, all that stuff, the precepts, all that shit, that's why it's one in the 4 dictums as being slanderous. Because to utilize those in any comparative process that does not then praise or elevate to its rightful place the Lotus Sutra, you've just slandered the Lotus Sutra. Okay? So understand that's where Nichiren is coming from, and that's where the Lotus Sutra is coming from, and that's where Tentai is coming from, that's where Dengyo is coming from, that's where Myolo is coming from. So, moreover, as the great teacher Tentai says in his commentary, when one tries to propagate the other sutras, one need not inquire into their exact position in the comparative classification of the doctrines, and this will not impair the understanding of their meaning. But when one tries to propagate the Lotus Sutra, unless one grasps its position in the doctrinal classification, which is number 1 at the highest of the high, one will fail to understand the meaning of its text. And in that process, you will create slander. These doctrinal classifications, in fact, constitute the very foundation upon which Tentai's teachings are erected. Tentai himself has given grave warning that if someone should attempt to describe his teaching as you have, without taking into consideration the order in which the Buddha teachings were set forth, without distinguishing between partial and perfect, or choosing between what is erroneous and what is correct, then no one should believe or accept what that person says. If you haven't done what I, Nichiren, have done, you shouldn't believe what they say. When you do not even understand this much, surely you deserve censure for attempting to quote from Tentai's commentaries in this irresponsible fashion. You grab a little bit here, you grab a line here, a line there. You didn't read the whole Gosho. That's what we've been doing forever as Soka members. Nobody reads the whole Gosho. They read a little box of 2 paragraphs. And then there's a tremendous expounding of a lot of other stuff. And it's done that way because the content is too much for most people to take at one time and retain anything. So let's try to retain little segments. As we grow in faith, though, we have to understand that those little segments weren't enough to get us to Buddhahood. We've got to read the whole Goshos. We got to master the Buddhism of the sowing. Okay? It's the only way Kosen Rufu can occur. So he says, when you do not even understand this much, surely you deserve censure for attempting to quote from Tentai's commentaries in this irresponsible fashion. In this section, dealing with the first of the three standards of comparison set forth in Tentai's commentary, that which inquires whether or not people of all capacities can attain Buddhahood through a particular sutra, he distinguishes two viewpoints of myo, or wonderful, the comparative myo and the absolute myo. We're going to get into it now. Good. From the viewpoint of the comparative myo, he further explains how one can determine the superiority or inferiority of any given Buddhist teaching by the criteria of the four teachings of doctrine and the four teachings of method, and those of the 5 periods of the Buddhist teaching. In cases where one is referring to the four teachings of doctrine, In cases where one is referring to the four teachings of doctrine, the teachings of the Buddha's lifetime are divided into 4 categories: the Tripitaka teaching, the connecting teaching, the specific teaching, and the perfect teaching. I've probably been conflating a couple of these. And one uses these categories to determine the relative superiority of the teaching. At times, as described in the annotations on the profound meanings of the Lotus Sutra, Myolo's further clarification, the first 3 of the 4 teachings are designated as rough, while the last one, the perfect teaching, is designated as wonderful. Hence, the Tripitaka connecting and specific teachings, which are rough teachings, are to be rejected. And the last one, the wonderful teaching, is to be chosen. Why? Because it's hundreds of years later when Myolo is making this comment versus when Tentai had first put it down. Okay, at the end of the second 500-year period, or at the end of the first 2,000 years. However, at this stage in the proceedings, by applying a lenient interpretation, the provisional teachings set forth in the sutras preached prior to the Lotus are still given a degree of recognition as providing a kind of temporary or tentative attainment of the way. For the time being, the Buddha wisdom expressed in the Flower Garland Sutra and that expressed in the Lotus Sutra are regarded as of equal worth. That is why Tentai in his commentary expresses the lenient interpretation that the Buddha wisdom shown at the beginning and that at the latter time are alike in representing the principle of perfect and immediate enlightenment. In cases where one is referring to the 5 periods of the Buddha's teachings, however, the teachings of his lifetime are divided into 5 time periods that correspond to the 5 flavors, namely the Flower Garland period, the Agama period, the Correct and Equal period, and the Wisdom period, and the Lotus period. In the case of a strict interpretation, in this case, a strict interpretation is applied. The first 4 periods or flavors are designated as rough, and the last is judged to be wonderful. Thus, the passage dealing with this strict interpretation states, those with the refined view, that is the Flower Garland view, and those with the rough view, that is the Agama, Correct and Equal, and Wisdom view, are equally guilty of error. Hence, because of their error, they deserve to be called persons with a rough view. The meaning of this passage of commentary is that though the Flower Garland Sutra embodies both the specific teaching and the perfect teaching part of it may be said to represent the Buddha wisdom. The Correct and Equal Sutras expound all 4 teachings, the Tripitaka teaching, the connecting teaching, the specific teaching, and the perfect teaching. And the perfect teaching apart likewise represents the Buddha wisdom. The Wisdom Sutras expound three teachings, the connecting, specific, and perfect teachings. And in this case as well, the perfect teaching part represents the Buddha wisdom. However, since the Flower Garland Sutra expounds the specific teaching, a spurious teaching, However, since the Flower Garland Sutra expounds the specific teaching, a spurious teaching, it's not the perfect teaching, along with the perfect teaching, the Buddha wisdom embodied in the sutra is contaminated with bad elements and therefore to be rejected. So you understand what I just said. Even though the Flower Garland's got the perfect teaching in it, because it's also teaching the specific teaching, it's contaminated. And in this 500-year period, fifth 500-year period, it's no longer valid. That's what he's really implying. However, since the Flower Garland Sutra expounds the specific teaching, a spurious teaching, along with the perfect teaching, the Buddha wisdom embodied in the sutra is contaminated with bad elements and therefore to be rejected. The Buddha wisdom embodied in the perfect teaching of the correct and equal sutras is likewise contaminated by the three earlier teachings accompanying it, which are spurious in nature. The Buddha wisdom embodied in the perfect teaching of the Wisdom Sutras in the same way is mixed with the spurious teachings of the two earlier teachings, the connecting and the specific teachings, which belong to the rough category. As a result of all this, although the term Buddha wisdom is used in the same way in all cases, the Buddha wisdom contained in the perfect teaching of the three categories of the sutras is bad because of its rough nature, which derives from the errors it contains, and therefore it is relegated to a lower level. Thus, a commentary using these categories of the four teachings to determine the true superiority or inferiority of the various sutras determines that, on first consideration, the term Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, applies only to the Tripitaka teaching. But on further consideration, all three teachings, the Tripitaka, connecting, and specific, should be termed Hinayana. That is, one first considers that the doctrines of the Tripitaka teaching set forth in the Agama Sutras, which deal with the 250 precepts, should all be labeled Hinayana doctrines and rejected for that reason. But on further consideration, the commentary concludes that all three teachings, the Tripitaka teaching and the connecting and specific teachings, the latter two of which are usually called Mahayana or great vehicle teachings, should all be labeled Hinayana doctrines. Such is the judgment set forth by the great teacher Chisho of our own country of Japan in his work on the commentary on the treatise of the Lotus Sutra. We come next to the discussion of the absolute Myo, which is the doctrine dealing with the opening up and merging of the sutras. At this time, the teachings set forth in the sutras preached prior to the Lotus Sutra, the provisional teachings which had been cast aside as undesirable, are now all merged into the great sea of the Lotus Sutra. Therefore, since these provisional teachings of the pre-Lotus Sutras, since these provisional teachings of the pre-Lotus Sutras enter into the great sea of the Lotus Sutra, there is no longer anything undesirable about them. All are blended into the single flavor of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. And this is the first time he's finally nailing it, because that's the only thing that absolute Myo is representing. Okay? So Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is contained in everything. So he's saying, all are blended into the single flavor of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo because of the inconceivably wonderful function of the great sea of the Lotus Sutra. Since there is no longer any reason to call them by separate names, such as in Nembutsu school, Precept school, True Word school, or Zen school, as was done in the past. Accordingly, the great teacher Tentai in his commentary states, the treatise on the Great Perfection of Wisdom says, when the various waters enter the sea, all alike become one salty flavor. When the various kinds of wisdom enter the wisdom that perceives the true nature of things, which is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, not the Lotus Sutra, they lose the names they previously bore. The commentary is saying, and again, the Lotus, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law. But understand that the Lotus Sutra that exists before the 5th 500-year period and the advent of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is subsequently, it's a provisional sutra. It does not open the way. Only the Lotus Sutra, when perceived by virtue of the teachings of Nichiren, and we have Nam-myoho Renge-kyo to rely on as the clarification of the law that's referred to time and again. Are we able to attain Buddhahood in our present form? And that's really what's being separated here. Theoretical Buddhism, which is what all those other teachings lead one to believe one is attained, versus actual Ichinen Sanzen, which one has to strive through their actions on a daily basis to the last moment of life to have actually attained. Okay? When the various kinds of wisdom enter the wisdom that perceives the true nature of things, what is that now? We all know, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, they lose the names they previously bore. They become one, the teachings of the enlightened mind. The commentaries say that there is no longer the slightest need to distinguish them by using the names that they originally bore. People in the world today, as well as followers of the Tendai school, intone the names of the sutras that correspond to the first four flavors. Sutras that were cast aside from the viewpoint of comparative myo, or again, they intone the names of various Buddhas or Bodhisattvas because they claim that after the opening up and merging of these with the Lotus Sutra, all belong to the wonderful entity of the Lotus. Before they had entered the great sea of the Lotus Sutra, they were each considered distinct and separate from the sutra. But since they are now merged in the great sea, it is a great mistake to go on labeling them good or bad, as was done in the past. Because Absolute Myo would say that they're all contained within the perfect teaching of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. The streams that in the past were shunned as undesirable, along with the cool waters that were found acceptable, have now become a single body of water issuing from one source alone, the Great Sea. Thus, whatever name one may call it by, it is the same water of the Great Sea. There are no teachings of Shakyamuni that are valid after the first 2,000 years. Okay, indeed, to call it by various different names is fine, but to do so while thinking of them as representing various different approaches is itself an erroneous approach. So long as one thinks of it as the single body of water, that is the Great Sea, there is no harm in following one's inclinations, going along with the teachings of a particular Buddha or Bodhisattvas, and continuing to intone whatever names one has in the past. Thus, because of such reasoning, people go on following their inclinations and intoning the Nimbutsu or carrying out the true word practices as before. If one applies a lenient interpretation in approaching the matter, one may perhaps view it in this way. But if one applies a strict interpretation, one can only say that such reasoning will most certainly lead one to fall into hell. I say this because although one person reasoning in this fashion may believe and go on intoning as in the past, if 10,000 people without understanding such reasoning simply believe and continue to carry out intoning practices based on biased views and biased emotions, then the one person may thereby attain Buddhahood. The 10,000 people will all fall into hell because they have been following evil doctrines based on erroneous views. So, did you all, if you understood that, that's basically saying, while under absolute myo, there is no distinction amongst all things. If you use that as an excuse or a prop to hang on to the teachings that are not absolute myo and keep doing them, you may be okay, but everybody that follows you thinks you're doing the right thing or sees benefit by what you're doing and then does what you're doing, they're all going to fall into hell, which is going to impact whether you actually are able to attain Buddhahood doing that by being an incorrect teacher. That's what you will have become at that point in time. So he says, the names and words used in the sutras, preached, we're in the middle of page 14, preached before the lotus is in setting forth their doctrines and the reasoning that belies their exposition, are all based on biased views and biased emotions, the kinds of provisional teachings that the Lotus Sutra is referring to when it says they stray into the dense forest of mistaken views, debating as to what exists and what does not. Therefore, and that's kind of a lot of what you've been doing, Mr. Lee. You've been debating this and that between different interpretations, when it's already clearly stated in the Lotus Sutra, according to Shakyamuni, I have not yet revealed the truth in these more than 40 years. So going back to any of these teachings that are based on sutras that precede the Lotus is like not believing Shakyamuni's imperative that you understand I haven't told the truth yet. And that in the fifth 500 years, all those teachings are going to no longer have power. All right? Therefore, those who continue to have faith and intone these names and words and go on contemplating and reasoning that underlies them, whether they truly understand what they are doing or not. So even if you do this out of innocence or even sincerity, are all without exception destined to fall into the great hell. Now, I'm not trying to threaten you, Mr. Lee, but when I read that over and over and over again from various Buddhas beyond this Nichiren qualifies how many other places this is said by Shakyamuni, by Tentai, by Dengyo, by Nagarjuna, by everybody, okay, then that's what gives me pause. All right, so if they understand what they are doing and yet go on intoning, they are like persons who look at, so if you do this by accident, you continue to hang on to the incorrect teachings, okay, you're still going to have retribution for it, okay? Hell isn't a destination like hell in Christianity where it's forever and ever and ever. You'll eventually remanifest as a temporary gathering of the five components, and you will have access to the realm of Buddhahood. Where you find it, you've probably created some obstruction to being able to do so. It might take you a few lifetimes. It might take you many lifetimes. That's the whole point. Then going further, so if you don't know what you're doing and you do it, you're going to get a bad result. And now he's going to say, if you know what you're doing and you do it, if they understand what they are doing and yet go on intoning, they are like persons who look for the great sea in the puddle left in the track of an ox's hoof, holders of erroneous views. How could they hope to escape rebirth in the three evil paths of existence? And if they do not understand what they are doing but go on intoning, they are persons who have been deceived and misled from the start because of their dogged adherence to the erroneous views of the provisional teachings. They are without doubt headed into the great citadel of hell of incessant suffering. Likewise, even after the provisional teachings have been opened up and merged with the Lotus Sutra, one must not accept these evil doctrines of the schools, okay, the evil teachers. These aren't because what they're teaching is not the teachings of Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni proceeded to get to the Lotus and say, drop all that stuff. That was then, this is now. Those other schools keep alive the incorrect teachings. All right? If you practice those incorrect teachings, you're also keeping alive those incorrect teachings, thereby making a cause. Likewise, even after the provisional teachings have been opened up and merged with the Lotus Sutra, second column, page 14, one must not accept these evil doctrines which have been rejected and cast aside as mere rough teachings, or intone their names or words, or the principles that underlie them, mixing such doctrines with those of the Lotus Sutra. The annotations on great concentration and insight, Mela states, from both the comparative and absolute viewpoints of mystic, we should abandon all that is bad. To be attached to the perfect teaching is bad, and to be attached to the other teachings is, of course, even worse. So how did Mela say something like this? Okay, the meaning of this passage is that whether dealing with the comparative myo or with the absolute myo, in both cases, one must remove oneself from wrong or evil doctrines. It is wrong to cling even to the perfect teaching of the earlier sutras, to say nothing of clinging to other teachings put forth in them. Do you understand? The word perfect here means that which is complete or fully satisfactory, while the word other means that which is defective. It is wrong to cling even to the perfect teaching in which all beings in the 10 worlds are equally capable of attaining Buddhahood, and such clinging must be rejected. How much worse is it then to cling to the evil or mistaken doctrines which are defective because they do not recognize that all the beings of the 10 worlds are equally capable of attaining Buddhahood, morning and evening, to accept and behold, read and recite, expound and transcribe them. Because you may look at the perfect teaching as the teaching that says you really already. Okay, let me hurry up here then. Again, I hope everybody understood that last paragraph, but let me read it again. The word perfect here means that it's not the teachings themselves, it's the content and the time and the understanding that one has and the ability to put those aside even though they have validity. They are not the validity you're supposed to be practicing and teaching to others. The word perfect here at the bottom of page 14 means that which is complete or fully satisfactory, while the word other means that which is defective. It is wrong to cling even to the perfect teaching, like to the Nirvana Sutra, in which all beings of the 10 worlds are equally capable of attaining Buddhahood, and such clinging must be rejected. How much worse is it then to cling to the evil or mistaken doctrines which are defective because they do not recognize that all living beings are equally capable of attaining Buddhahood morning and evening, to accept and uphold, read, recite, expound, and transcribe it. Top of page 15. Even though the perfect teaching of the earlier sutras may now have been opened up and merged with the Lotus Sutra, this does not mean that the perfect teaching of the earlier sutras is one in flavor with the Lotus Sutra. Though it may be opened up and merged with the body of the Lotus Sutra, it is still what is termed the provisional teaching within the body of the Lotus Sutra, not a true teaching. When this provisional teaching within the body of the Lotus Sutra is for a time extracted and becomes external to that body, then the Buddhas apply distinctions to the one Buddha vehicle and preach it as though it were three. Then the term perfect is applied to this provisional teaching, and one speaks of the perfect teaching that is the three vehicles. From earlier times, the simile of the golden staff has been employed in explaining this matter of the three vehicles. Suppose that one were to take a golden staff, break it into three pieces, and hand one piece to each of the persons who, because of their different capacities, represent the three vehicles of the voice here, the cause awakened one, and the bodhisattva. One might say then to them, these are all made of gold, and since they are all alike in being gold, how can you regard them as different from one another and judge one to be superior or to another? On first hearing this, this would seem to be a reasonable interpretation, but in fact, it is not based on it is based on an erroneous understanding by scholars. Now, if we examine the true meaning of the simile, we see that when the Buddha took the golden staff, which represents the provisional teaching found within the body of the Lotus Sutra, he directed it toward the representatives of the three different capacities, and as something external to the body of the Lotus Sutra, flourished it three times. But the persons of different capacities, seeing the shining of the staff, failed to understand what had happened, and all supposed that the staff had actually been bestowed upon them. If that were true, that if the golden staff had indeed been broken into three pieces, then the simile would be perfectly apt. But the Buddha did not break the golden staff of the provisional teaching into three pieces. He merely waved it three times. The persons with their different capacities, however, persisted in thinking that the staff had been broken into three pieces. This misunderstanding has led to an erroneous view of truly great proportions indeed. The benefits of the provisional teaching that is within the body of the Lotus Sutra are merely flourished three times in the presence of the persons of the three different capacities who are external to that body. But this does not mean that the inconceivably perfect and true teaching of the wonderful entity of the Lotus Sutra is being flourished in their presence. Thus, though one may argue that the external shine-in that was visible to the persons of the three vehicles has now been opened up and merged with the entity of the provisional teaching that was present all along within the body of the Lotus Sutra, It is still the provisional teaching that was present all along, not in any sense the perfect teaching within that body. One must keep this in mind in order to correctly understand the doctrines as they apply to the provisional and true teachings within the body of the Lotus Sutra and external to it. And I don't think many people might have understood what I was just saying. I do. I'm not going to try and explain it because I think it really is a circumstance of capacity and background information for you to really understand what he was just talking about there. But I want to finish this Gosho, so I'm going to continue rather than trying to go back and glean every little bit for every person that might not understand. You might have to read the Gosho as much as I have to understand the Gosho. Next, we come to the doctrines of the Zen school. This is for you, Mr. Lee, which claim to represent a separate transmission outside the sutras, independent of words or writings, which speak of something not transmitted by the Buddhas and patriarchs, which state that the teachings of the sutras are like fingers pointing at the moon, and that the very body is the Buddha. Doctrines that say they do not depend on words and writings, do not rely on the Buddhas or the patriarchs, do not study or practice doctrinal teachings, do not put faith in painted or wooden teachings or wooden images. In refuting such doctrines, one should ask why. If the Zen school does not rely on the Buddha and the patriarchs, it talks about the 28 patriarchs of India and the 6 patriarchs of China, and why it keeps talking about how Venerable Maheke Shyapa was and why it keeps talking about how the Venerable Maheke Shyapa was handed a flower branch by Shakyamuni Buddha and smiled, receiving the single truth of the mind on Eagle Peak and handing it down to the Zen school. Again, if this school has no use for the patriarchs, then why does it revere the great teacher Bodhidharma as its founding patriarch? And if one has no use for the doctrines of the sutras, then why in its morning and evening devotion does it keep on intoning mantras and dhalanis? Why does it discuss and read and recite the Shumaragama Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, or the Perfect Enlightenment Sutra? And if it puts no faith in the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, then why, when walking, standing, sitting, or lying down, do its followers recite the formula, homage to the 3 treasures? Press them with questions such as these. If they next come to you with various kinds of wild statements couched in terms that you have never heard before, address them as follows. Point out that there are 3 types of persons, those of superior capacity, those of middling capacity, and those of inferior capacity, and that the Buddhist teachings are consequently taught in 3 ways in order to fit all these 3, in order to fit these 3 capacities. The Zen school, too, in its doctrine, presents its teachings in 3 categories of reasoning approach. In 3 categories of reasoning approach, capacity gates, and highest enlightenment. I'm sure you must know all that, Mr. Lee. To fit with these 3 capacities. Ask then, which of the 3 capacities, categories of capacity your interoculars believe you belong to, that they confront you with these doctrinal terms you have never heard of before. Press them to answer whether they think they should be addressed through the reasoning approach, the capacity gates, or the highest attainment. Because none of them will understand what the hell that really is, and so none of them will be able to answer that question. The reasoning approach designates that which is employed to explain the Zen doctrines to a person of inferior capacity through the use of reason. The capacity gates approach is that used with a person of middling capacity. If the question is posed, what is your original face? One answers the arboravitae tree in the garden, and in this way sets forth the Zen doctrine. The term highest attainment applies to a person of superior capacity. Such a person does not receive the Zen doctrine from the patriarchs, nor does he receive it from the Buddha. He has the capacity to understand the Zen doctrine by himself. When Mahekeshayapa smiled and received a flower on Eagle Peak, thereby becoming a recipient of the single truth of the mind, this was still an example of a capacity of the middling category. In effect, then, what is known as the Zen doctrine began when Mahekeshayapa received the flowering branch, and the doctrine has come down to the present time. This flower that was given to him, was it a flower from a tree or a flower from a plant? To which of the 5 primary colors did it belong? What color was it? And what sort of leaves did it have? Or should one inquire one should inquire in detail about such matters? Because there's no answers to those questions. The Zen school doesn't have them. If the Zen school were able to present this flower just as it is, then we would know that just as it is, in truth, grasps at least a portion of the single truth of the mind. But even if it has, that does not accord with the true intention of the Buddha. Why? Because the Zen school does not put faith in the Lotus Sutra. I'll go just a little bit over that. The intention is described in detail in the end of the prose section of the expedient means of the Lotus Sutra, which they may look up and read for themselves. Again, the Zen doctrine teaches that the Zen doctrine teaches that one should rid oneself of all attachments. If one leans to the left, that is an attachment to that direction. If to the right, that too is an attachment. And so it is a teaching that ceaselessly wavers between one side and another. In refuting such an argument, you should reply by asking why the Zen proponents, while constantly criticizing others for their attachments, fail to free themselves from their own attachments. You should state the matter this way: though you blame others for their attachments, why can you not abandon your own attachment to the view that regards others' attachments as attachments? Of all these teachings that exist, there is not one that has not been expounded by the Buddha or the three existences of past, present, and future. If you, the proponents of Zen, claim that your teachings are not transmitted by the Buddha and patriarchs, that they have not been handed down from the Buddha and patriarchs, then the Zen doctrine must be something handed down from the heavenly devil, must it not? Therefore, you have not gone beyond the stage of 2 opposing views of the self that ends with death and a self that is eternally unchanging and without doubt are destined to fall into the hell of incessant suffering. You don't understand the temporary gathering of the 5 components. You still believe in a karmic personage that goes on as an eternal, which has already been refuted by the Buddhist teachings. You should keep using their own words again and again in this fashion to drive them into a corner. However, since they all lack learning, they will not listen to reason. They cannot understand the reasoning of others. Don't forget, this letter is being written to Sairenbo so he can go debate priests of other schools. Not Sairenbo, pardon me, Samibo. You should keep using their own words again and again in this fashion to drive them into a corner. However, since they all lack learning, they will not listen to reason. They cannot understand the reasoning of others, nor do they understand the flaws of their own reasoning. They are persons of a benighted comprehension, and since they refuse to bow to reason, addressing them is like trying to paint a picture on flowing water. Next, with regard to the assertion that this very body is the Buddha, you should demand to know what kind of reasoning supports such an assertion. If there is no reasoning to support it, if they are simply claiming that this very body is the Buddha without any justification, point out that it must then be the teaching of the heavenly devil. And Nichiren wouldn't be writing this if he didn't know that Zen's doctrine does not contain an explanation for that comment. Therefore, as soon as one hears the words, this very body is the Buddha, one immediately suspects that the Zen school has simply stolen the assertion made by the Tendai school that one may attain Buddhahood in this very body and adapted it to its own school. If so, then demand to know if this very body is the Buddha means that one can attain Buddhahood as described in the Lotus Sutra. If there is no such reasoning behind the statement, if it is simply a set of words one uses, then it is a meaningless assertion that anyone at all may use. It is like, for example, a mere commoner who goes about proclaiming that he is a king. There is nothing to stop him from declaring himself to be a king. But no matter how his tongue may delight in making such a declaration, he remains no more than a commoner, humble and despised in station. Or it is like someone insisting that mere shards and rubble are in fact jewels. Simply declaring that stones and shards are jewels has never once turned stones into real jewels. And you are doing the same thing when you go on repeating the formula, this very body is the Buddha. Mere words that have no reality behind them, a most pitiful performance. Next, with regard to the statement that the Zen doctrine is independent of words or writing, just what do you mean by words or writing that you can claim that the Zen doctrine stand independent from them? Words and writing are the medium by which the minds of all living beings are revealed. A person's writings tell us the nature of that person's mind. The mental and physical components of the individual are in the end inseparable, and hence what a person has written and will reveal whether that person is well or poorly endowed in nature. Words and writing, then, are the medium through which these inseparable factors of the mental and physical makeup of the living beings are revealed. If you do not depend on words or writing, then you cannot give expression to your mental and physical makeup. Show me, if you can, how you can express even one phrase of the Zen doctrine without having recourse to the 6 sense organs. Press the argument in this manner. Moreover, if you say that there is something that exists apart from the 6 sense organs, or if you say that there is nothing that exists apart from them, in either case you are still within the scope of 2 opposing views of existence and non-existence. If you say nothing exists, this is the view of non-existence. If you say something exists, this is the view of existence. And neither of these 2 views accords with the truth, because it's neither existence nor non-existence. It's the truth of the middle way. Right? So, finally, Zen got nothing on any of this. It's much deeper than Zen, bro. Finally, with regard to the statement that the teachings of the sutras are like a finger pointing to the moon, does this mean in effect that once one has seen the moon, the finger becomes the finger becomes superfluous? If that is the meaning, then as far as you are concerned, are your own father and mother superfluous? Is the teaching superfluous? As far as the disciple is concerned? Is the earth superfluous? Is the sky superfluous? Meaningless? Don't need it? Your statement is like saying that before you were born, your father and mother were indeed necessary, but once you were born, they ceased to be of any use. Or like saying that a teacher is certainly needed while one is acquiring a skill, but after one has acquired the skill, he is no longer needed. That the sky is useful while it is sending down moisture, but becomes useless after the rain has fallen. Or that the earth must exist so that it can bring forth plants and trees, but that after the plants and trees have come forth, it is no longer needed. There is a common saying, once past the throat, the hotness is forgotten. Once the sickness is cured, the physician is forgotten. And your statement is no different from this. The sutras are nothing other than the words and writings are the very life of the Buddha, of the Buddhas of the 3 existences of past, present, and future, as Tentai states in his commentary. Tentai was among the patriarchs of the Zen school in China. Would you reject these words of one of your own patriarchs? Moreover, words and writing are your very body and mind. They are the ever-continuing body and mind of all living beings of the 3 existences. Why would you discard what is in fact your original face in favor of something that is independent of words or writing? This is like a man long ago who, when he moved into a new house, forgot to take his wife along. By proceeding in such a manner, how can you hope to learn the true Zen doctrine? How pitiful this Zen teaching. Refuted in this fashion, we come next to the doctrines of the so-called 6 schools, the flower garland, Dharma characteristics, 3 treatises, Dharma analysis, treasury, establishment of truth, and precept schools. How florid may be their presentation of the doctrines, they are easily refuted. After you have let them say their fill, simply read to them the memorial in which the leaders of the schools of Buddhism of Nara, the southern capital, admitted their defeat. The patriarchs and teachers of the 6 schools long ago wrote this document admitting they submit to the teachings of the Tendai school and presented it to Emperor Kamu. Accordingly, this document is preserved at the head temple of the Tendai school on Mount Hei. In addition, a copy of it is in the possession of the imperial court, and copies have been preserved and handed down in the families of various scholars. From that time down to the present, in the latter day of the law, and the proponents of the flower garland and the other schools that make up the 6 schools have never once been able to raise their head. Why then should anyone, because they've all been defeated in debate, is the point. That's what he's talking about, right? Mm-hmm. You understand?
Yes.
Okay. Well, and then they not only were defeated in the debate, they acknowledged that they were defeated in debate, and all said, Tendai is like Dengyo is all that in a bag of chips. This is about Dengyo beating everybody. Okay. From that time down to the present, in the latter day, the proponents of the flower garland and the other teachings that make up the 6 schools have never once been able to raise their head since they admitted defeat to Dengyo. Why then should anyone come forward now with the provisional teachings which have already been discarded, with these doctrines by which they can never attain the way, and declare, as these schools do, that they represent the truth? They rebuke the proponents of these schools rebuke these schools. Sorry, I was distracted. By then, pardon me. Let me start over. There's only one more page. I'm going to go over an hour. From that time down to the present, in the latter day of the law, the proponents of the flower garland and the other schools that make up the 6 schools have never once been able to raise their heads. Why then should anyone come forward now with the provisional teachings which have already been discarded, with these doctrines by which no one can ever attain the way, and declare, as these schools do, that they represent the truth? Rebuke the proponents of these schools for their lack of understanding. I will speak next about the doctrine of the True Word School. You should begin your discussion by asking whether the persons you are addressing believe that the 3 sutras upon which the True Word School bases its doctrines were expounded by the thus come one Mahavajrana or by the thus come one Shakyamuni. If they reply that they were expounded by Shakyamuni, then point out that the teachings expounded by Shakyamuni over the 50 years of his preaching fall into the 3 categories, those that the Buddha has preached, now preaches, and will preach. As to which category the Mahavajrana Sutra and others of the 3 True Words Sutras belong. When they indicate to which of these 3 categories the sutras belong, you may then easily use the teaching I taught you to prove to them that they must be inferior to the Lotus Sutra. If you should assert that these 3 sutras were preached at the same, so he's comparing it to the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. This lotus is superior, pardon me, it's from the lotus. This lotus is superior to all teachings that I have preached, now preach, or will preach. Okay, that's why the Daishonin qualifies the Lotus Sutra as the supreme teaching, because Shakyamuni's statement qualifies it as such. If they should assert that these 3 sutras were preached at the same time as the Lotus Sutra and are the same as the Lotus Sutra in principle, then point out that only the Lotus Sutra sets forth only the single truth that is pure and perfect, which is unmixed with any of the expedient means that were expounded earlier. The Mahavajrana Sutra and the other True Word Sutras, on the other hand, contain all the other 4 teachings. How then can one say that they were preached at the same time as the Lotus Sutra and are the same as it in principle? Berate them for making such an erroneous assertion. Next, if they should say that the True Word Sutras were preached by the thus come one Mahavajrana, then inquire in detail as to the father and mother of this thus come one Mahavajrana, and as to where he was born and where he died. There is in fact not a single phrase or verse in these sutras to tell who Mahavajrana's father and mother were, or reveals where he was born or died, or where he preached. The thus come one Mahavajrana is a name without a reality. By taking this approach, the true word doctrines are particularly easy to disprove. In judging the principles that underlie the doctrines of a school, one must first determine whether the Lord of teachings who expounded them actually existed before one can decide if these teachings are effective. For example, in matters pertaining to the esoteric teachings in theory and the esoteric teachings in practice, the most profound doctrines of the true word school, one finds on examination that there are errors or untruths introduced by the persons who translated the sutras into Chinese, or that the profound doctrines of the Lotus Sutra have been stolen and read into those parts of the true word teachings that deal with the esoteric teachings in practice. There is much that is suspicious here. Therefore, one should stress how important it is to determine the superiority or inferiority of the sutras on the basis of whether or not the Lord of teachings for those sutras actually existed. And again, I'm reading all of this to you, Mr. Lee. Can you tell that Nichiren studied his ass off and knew what he was talking about? It wasn't bullshitting at all when he made these declaratives that I'm constantly referring to, and why my faith allows me to make the same declaratives? Because I've read him make these same statements over and over and over again. You want 200 pages, I guarantee you it's there. Next, if they should state that the thus come one Mahavrachana is the Buddha of the Dharma body, point out that among the provisional teachings expounded prior to the Lotus Sutra, there are some that speak of a thus come one of the Dharma body, but that is as far as the Lotus Sutra is concerned. But as far as the Lotus Sutra is concerned, all such teachings have been discarded because they belong to the time when, as the Buddha said, I have not yet revealed the truth. What then is so wonderful about the fact that Mahavrachana is a Buddha of the Dharma body? So are you, Mr. Lee. It is, if they reply by saying that he is wonderful because he is without beginning and without end, then point out that this is invariably true not only of the thus come one Mahavrachana, but of all living beings, even down to mole crickets, ants, mosquitoes, or gadflies. All in body and mind are without beginning and all without end. If they believe that living beings have a beginning and have an end, then they subscribe to an erroneous view put forth by the non-Buddhists. Ask them if their views are the same as those of the non-Buddhists. Finally, we come to the Nimbutsu, which represents the doctrine in use by the Pure Land school. This doctrine is among the most provisional of all the provisional teachings, comparable to a dream seen within a dream. It is a name without a reality. It is a name without a reality. Amida doesn't really exist. And because there is no reality to it, it could not possibly fulfill the wishes of all living beings for rebirth in the Pure Land. The Buddha of which it speaks is Amida Buddha, who is conditioned in nature and impermanent. How then could he surpass a principle that is eternal and imperishable? Therefore, the great teacher Dengyo of our country states in his commentary, the Buddha of a reward body which exists depending on causes and conditions represents a provisional result obtained in a dream, while the Buddha eternally endowed with the three bodies represents the true Buddha from the time before enlightenment. Thus, with these words, he warns against belief in Amida Buddha, a Buddha who is conditioned and impermanent and rejects him. And since this Amida Buddha, upon whom the Pure Land proponents rely, is a name without a reality, something existing in name only, without any body, even though they may expound in great detail the doctrines that promise rebirth in the Pure Land, preaching them so that they sound as lofty as Mount Sumeru or as deep as the great ocean, such doctrines are all utterly useless. If the proponents of the Pure Land doctrines insist that there are clear and authoritative passages in the sutras and treatises to support their views, point out that these passages appear in works preached when the Buddha had not yet revealed the truth, not only in the three Pure Land sutras, but in other works, beginning with the Flower Garland Sutra and other sutras, teachings, treatises, and commentaries. There are perfectly clear passages pertaining to the achievement of Buddhahood, are there not? But when they are passages belonging to the provisional teachings, it is surely foolish of you to cling to them as you do. For they represent warped views not found in the true sutras and treatises, Mr. Lee. Whatever reasons the Pure Land proponents may put forward to support and ornament their doctrines, whatever sutras, passages they may cite, they relate to a provisional result obtained in a dream realm. A doctrine that is of no use. Keep repeating this point again and again. That's the end of questions and answers on the various schools on page 21. Thank you all for your time. That's the end for today. Bye.